The fork stopped halfway to Gray's mouth, suspended in air like time itself had stuttered, and in the sudden stillness of that expensive Seattle steakhouse, he heard something that made his blood remember temperatures it hadn't felt in 20 years. Not a sound from the restaurant itself, where conversations continued their predictable rhythm of business deals and anniversary celebrations, but an absence of sound, a particular quality of silence that only exists in the moment, before a child asks a question they shouldn't need to ask. His eyes tracked to the entrance where a small figure in an oversized yellow raincoat stood backlit by street lamps, and every instinct honed by years of surviving impossible situations screamed that this moment mattered in ways he couldn't yet define. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with blonde curls escaping from beneath a hood still dripping with Seattle's perpetual rain, and she moved through the restaurant with the determined precision of someone executing a plan rehearsed mentally dozens of times. Her sneakers were mismatched, one pink with cartoon characters and one plain white with permanent marker scribbles, and they squeaked against marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. She carried crumpled dollar bills clutched in one small fist, like they represented all the currency in the world, which perhaps to her they did. The hostess glanced up from her reservation podium with that particular expression service workers develop when confronted with situations outside their training manual's scope. Gray set down his fork with deliberate care, the small clink of silver against china somehow audible despite the ambient noise, and watched the child's trajectory with the same analytical focus he'd once applied to potential threats entering his territory. She wasn't scanning tables looking for someone, wasn't lost or confused, but aimed directly toward his corner booth as if pulled by invisible wire. The calculated part of his brain noted escape routes, assessed whether this represented some elaborate setup, considered possibilities ranging from distraction technique to elaborate con. The other part, the part he'd buried under years of calculated violence and strategic cruelty, recognized something in her walk that made his chest constrict with memory. She stopped at his table with the sudden completeness of decision made final, and her eyes when they met his were too old for her face, carrying knowledge that childhood should never accumulate. Her hands moved to place the crumpled bills on white linen that probably cost more to clean than she held in currency, arranging them with care that suggested she understood symbolic weight exceeded monetary value. The restaurant continued its oblivious consumption around them, 50 people absorbed in their own narratives, while something fundamental shifted in the space between a crime lord and a child. Gray found himself leaning back slightly, not in retreat, but to create space for whatever words required this much courage to deliver. His mind cataloged details with automatic precision. The fraying hem of her raincoat, the band-aid on her left knee decorated with stars, the way her chin lifted in anticipation of rejection. "If I pay, can you stop the screaming?" Her voice carried no tears, no dramatic trembling, just exhausted practicality of someone who'd learned that problems required solutions, and solutions required resources. She didn't break eye contact, didn't look away or down or anywhere that would signal submission, and Gray felt something crack in the careful architecture of indifference he'd constructed over decades. The words hit him with physical force, not because of their content, but because of their tone, the specific melody of desperation wrapped in business proposition. "The man upstairs screams every night, and my mom works, and I can't sleep, and I counted all my money, and this is what I have." The explanation tumbled out with rehearsed efficiency, as if she'd practiced this presentation, refined it, understood she had limited time before adult intervention separated her from her objective. Gray's fingers drummed once against the table's edge, the only external sign of internal recalibration happening at speeds that had kept him alive through 3 separate assassination attempts. His mouth opened to respond with some dismissal that would send her away without answers, but the words died before reaching air because he suddenly understood what had frozen his fork. It wasn't her appearance or her request that triggered recognition, but the specific quality of desperate calculation that had brought her here. She'd assessed her problem, identified someone with power, and made approach despite all reasonable fear because the alternative was continuation of intolerable circumstances. That particular combination of courage and mathematics belonged to children who'd stopped being children too early, who'd learned that survival sometimes required negotiations with dangerous people. Gray knew this because he'd been that child once, standing in different restaurant making different plea to different man who'd looked at him with same mixture of surprise and recognition. The memory surfaced unbidden, himself at 7, asking neighborhood loan shark for help with his mother's debts, offering to work off the amount in whatever capacity required. The loan shark had laughed, then sent him away with warning about knowing his place. And Gray had learned that powerlessness was a temporary condition that could be remedied through careful accumulation of leverage and fear. But this child standing before him now with her $73 and her impossible request deserved different response than he'd received. The decision formed not through conscious deliberation, but through something more primitive, recognition between survivors of similar damage that transcended logic or self-interest. "Sit down," he said finally, voice carrying none of the edge he typically used with strangers, and gestured to the chair across from him. The girl climbed onto the seat with effort that revealed her smallness, legs dangling well above floor, yellow raincoat pooling around her like deflated parachute. Gray caught the waiter's eye with subtle gesture that brought immediate attention, despite the man being halfway across the dining room serving another table. "What's your name?" The question emerged softer than he'd intended, and he watched her weigh whether honesty served her negotiating position. Children from difficult circumstances learned early that names carried power, that giving them away carelessly could be weaponized against you later. Her hesitation lasted only seconds before pragmatism won over caution, probably reasoning that someone who could actually stop screaming was worth the risk of identification. "Tori," she answered, and added nothing else. No last name or additional details, just the single syllable offered like down payment on larger truth. Gray nodded acknowledgement, while his mind already worked through implications of her presence here, calculating what circumstances would drive a 6-year-old to seek out a stranger in an expensive restaurant with proposition about stopping screams. The waiter arrived with perfect timing, hovering at distance that suggested he'd registered unusual nature of this interaction. "Bring the young lady whatever she wants from the menu," Gray instructed. Then to Tori, "When did you last eat?" The question seemed to surprise her more than anything else that had happened, as if she'd prepared for rejection or acceptance of her offer, but not for concern about her immediate welfare. Her eyes darted to the menu the waiter presented, overwhelmed by options that probably represented food she'd only seen in pictures or television commercials. She pointed at a picture of pasta with careful deliberation, and Gray noticed how her finger left small smudge on glossy page, evidence of hands not recently washed. "And bring bread immediately," he added to the waiter, who departed with efficiency born from years of reading his employer's moods. Gray returned his attention to Tori, studying her with same intensity he'd once reserved for contracts and territorial maps, looking for patterns that would reveal the complete picture her simple request only partially illuminated. "Tell me about the screaming," he said, not as command but invitation, and watched her small shoulders relax fractionally at being taken seriously. She'd probably expected adult dismissal, the standard reassurances that everything was fine, and she should go home and let grown-ups handle grown-up problems. But Gray had built empire by recognizing when people were telling truth about danger, by trusting instincts that separated legitimate threats from exaggerated fears, and everything about Tori's demeanor screamed authenticity of distress. "He screams words I don't understand," she began, voice dropping to near whisper, as if the man might somehow hear her even here. "Sometimes he's crying too, but mostly just screaming, and it goes on for hours, and the walls are really thin, and I can hear everything even with my pillow over my ears." The bread arrived, and she reached for it with hunger that confirmed Gray's suspicion about irregular meals, tearing into the warm roll with focus that temporarily displaced conversation. Gray waited while she ate, using the silence to process information and formulate questions that would extract necessary details without traumatizing her further. The screaming she described didn't sound like domestic violence or substance abuse, but more like night terrors or psychological break, someone fighting demons visible only to themselves. The fact that her mother worked during these episodes meant the child was alone with the sounds, processing adult suffering without adult context to make sense of it. "Where's your mother now?" The question came gently, without accusation, though he could feel anger building at woman who'd left child alone in circumstances that drove her to desperate measures. Tori swallowed her mouthful of bread before answering, and Gray noted defensive shift in her posture, the instinctive protection of parent even when that parent's choices seemed questionable. Children from unstable homes often developed fierce loyalty to caregivers who failed them, unable to direct anger at only source of security they possessed. "She works at the hospital, night shift in the emergency room," Tori explained with pride that suggested this information represented important credential. "She saves people's lives, so she has to be there even when she's tired, and I'm big enough to stay home alone because I'm 6 now, and I know all the safety rules." The defensive quality in her voice revealed previous challenges to this arrangement, probably from teachers or neighbors who'd noticed signs of inadequate supervision. The hostess materialized beside the table with professional concern, barely masking horror at breach of restaurant protocol, reaching for Tori with gentle hands designed to extract problems without causing scenes. Gray's eyes shifted to her with the kind of look that made experienced men reconsider their entire life trajectory, and she froze mid-reach, as if she'd suddenly remembered standing near live ammunition. "The young lady and I are having a conversation," he said quietly, voice carrying the particular softness that people who truly understood violence used instead of volume. The hostess retreated with speed that suggested excellent survival instincts, though her worried glances from the hostess station indicated she was calculating whether to call police or child services. Gray filed away the need to address this later, to ensure that his dinner companion wouldn't face questions from authorities that could complicate already difficult home situation. The pasta arrived with theatrical presentation that seemed absurd given the circumstances, but Tori's eyes widened at the steam rising from the plate like she was witnessing magic. She ate with mechanical efficiency that spoke of meals treated as fuel rather than pleasure, and Gray found himself ordering additional items despite her not requesting them, watching calories accumulate on the table like he could somehow compensate for all the meals she'd probably skipped. Between bites, she returned to her explanation with the persistence of someone who knew opportunity might not present itself again, determined to make her case completely before dismissal came. "I tried asking him to be quieter, but he didn't answer when I knocked, and my mom said not to bother him because everyone has problems." Gray's jaw tightened at this revelation that the child had attempted direct intervention, that she'd stood outside the door of someone clearly in psychological crisis and tried to negotiate peace. The courage that required was substantial, but so was the danger, and he found himself grateful that her knocking had gone unanswered. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, and watched her small face scrunch with concentration as she calculated time in the imprecise way children measured duration. "Since summer," she answered finally, "when he moved in. And it's been getting worse because at first it was only sometimes, but now it's almost every night. And my teacher says I need to pay better attention, but I can't when I'm so tired." The academic consequences of sleep deprivation added another layer to the situation, evidence that the problem was bleeding into all areas of her life. Gray made mental note to investigate the school situation as well, to ensure no mandatory reporters had already initiated investigations that would complicate his intervention. "And your mother doesn't hear this?" The question contained no judgment, just data collection, but Tori's expression shifted to defensive again. "She works until morning, and then she sleeps during the day when it's quiet, and I don't wake her up because she's so tired and she needs rest to help people at the hospital." The logic was sound from child's perspective, sacrificing her own needs to preserve parents' capacity to function, but it revealed dangerous pattern of parentification where the 6-year-old was managing adult problems. Gray pushed his own plate away. Appetite completely disappeared in face of this accumulating evidence of system failure. A child was falling through gaps between mother's necessary absence, neighbors' untreated trauma, and societal indifference to suffering that happened behind closed doors. That she'd identified him as potential solution demonstrated either remarkable instinct or desperate randomness, and he wasn't certain which possibility disturbed him more. "Why did you come to me specifically?" he asked, needing to understand her selection process. Tori set down her fork with care that mimicked his earlier gesture, and her eyes met his with uncomfortable directness. "I've seen you before, in the neighborhood, and people move out of your way on the sidewalk and they look scared, but also respectful, and I thought maybe someone like that could make the screaming stop." Her assessment was accurate enough to be alarming, evidence that she'd been observing human behavior and power dynamics with sophistication beyond her years. The fact that she'd correctly identified him as someone with influence, that she'd tracked his movements through shared neighborhood and drawn conclusions about his capacity for action, suggested intelligence that could serve her well or destroy her depending on circumstances. Gray recognized himself at that age, watching adults with predatory focus, learning who held power and how it was exercised, understanding that survival required accurate mapping of social hierarchies. The recognition created obligation he couldn't articulate, but felt nonetheless. "The money," he said, gesturing to the crumpled bills still sitting on white tablecloth between them. "Where did it come from?" Tori's hand moved protectively toward the cash, and he saw the calculation in her expression, the fear that he might take it without providing service. "I saved it from allowance and birthday money, And sometimes I find coins in the laundry room machines that people forget, she explained, and Gray heard the unspoken pride in having accumulated this amount through patient effort. $73 represented enormous sum to child living on margins, probably months of careful saving and self-denial, forgoing treats and toys to accumulate currency for this desperate gambit. That she'd been willing to spend it all on a stranger's help, rather than keeping it for emergencies or small pleasures, spoke to the intensity of her distress. Gray felt something unfamiliar move through his chest, recognition of courage that shamed most adults he knew, who negotiated millions without ever risking anything that truly mattered to them. "I'm going to help you," he said finally, and watched relief flood her features with intensity that made her suddenly look even younger than her 6 years. "But I don't want your money, and I need you to trust that I'll handle this in a way that doesn't make things worse." Tori's hand moved from protecting the bills to pushing them toward him with insistence, child's understanding of transactions requiring that payment must be rendered for value received. "My mom says nothing's free, and people who help without wanting something are usually lying about what they really want," she quoted with the precision of often repeated lesson. Gray felt anger toward Courtney surge again, but also recognized the wisdom in teaching daughter to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous. The world Tori was growing up in required such cynicism for survival, even as it killed something essential about childhood's capacity for trust. "Your mother is right," Gray acknowledged, "but sometimes people help because they understand what it's like to need help and not get it, and they don't want someone else to feel that way." The explanation felt inadequate even as he spoke it, unable to fully articulate the complex mixture of memory and moral calculation driving his decision. Tori studied him with those two old eyes, weighing his words against her experience, trying to determine if he represented exception to rules she'd learned. "Are you a dangerous person?" she asked with directness that would have been amusing if it wasn't so serious. Gray considered lying, offering reassurance that would let her categorize him as safe, but something about her deserved honesty. "Yes," he answered simply. "I am a dangerous person, but not to you, and not to people who don't deserve it." The qualification was more nuanced than most 6-year-olds could process, but Tori nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Good," she said with satisfaction that startled him. "Because I think the screaming needs someone dangerous to stop it, because regular people can't or won't." Her logic was flawed, but also contained kernel of truth that Gray couldn't entirely refute. Sometimes problems persisted precisely because good people were too constrained by rules and procedures to address them effectively, while someone willing to operate outside normal boundaries could resolve situations that official channels left to fester. Gray signaled for the check with gesture that brought it immediately, and he noticed Tori tracking the interaction, observing how power functioned through unspoken commands and instant compliance. He was teaching her things through simple demonstration, providing education in how authority worked that would shape her understanding of social dynamics. The responsibility of that made him more careful with his movements, aware that she was studying him as template for how capable people navigated the world. "I need your address," he said while signing the receipt, and Tori recited it from memory with precision that suggested she'd prepared for this moment. Pike Street, not far from his own residence in completely different building that might as well have existed in separate universe given the difference in amenities and security. "Don't tell your mother about this conversation yet," he instructed, and saw brief conflict cross her features before she nodded agreement. The request to keep secrets from parent clearly violated other lessons she'd been taught, but her need for solution outweighed her loyalty to transparency. Gray stood, and Tori slid off her chair with less grace than she'd climbed up, yellow raincoat resuming its parachute-like quality around her small frame. She looked up at him from height that emphasized the disparity in their sizes and power, and he saw trust in her expression that he absolutely did not deserve, but would try to honor nonetheless. "How long will it take?" she asked as they walked toward the exit, and Gray appreciated the practical question that focused on timeline rather than method. "Soon," he promised, deliberately vague because he needed to assess situation before committing to specific schedule. "But it will stop. I guarantee that." Tori smiled at him then, first genuine smile she'd displayed all evening, and it transformed her face from tired and worried to briefly, heartbreakingly young. The hostess watched them leave, with expression that suggested she was absolutely calling someone the moment they cleared the door, but Gray's reputation would smooth over any concerns before they became actual problems. He held the door for Tori, and she stepped out into Seattle rain that had intensified during their meal, pulling her hood up against the cold. "Thank you," she said with formality, that suggested someone had taught her manners even in circumstances that weren't always kind. And then she was gone. Yellow raincoat disappearing into the wet darkness like ghost who delivered message and fulfilled purpose. Gray stood in the rain for several minutes after Tori disappeared, letting the cold water soak through his expensive suit while he processed what had just happened and what he'd committed himself to doing. The restaurant's warm light spilled onto the sidewalk behind him, evidence of world he could return to if he chose. But something fundamental had shifted in that conversation, with a 6-year-old girl carrying $73. His phone buzzed with messages from associates who expected responses, business that had seemed urgent an hour ago and now felt entirely irrelevant. He pulled out the device and typed brief instructions to his most trusted investigator, a former FBI analyst who'd discovered that working for Gray paid better and asked fewer ethical questions than government employment. The message contained Tori's address and simple directive: comprehensive background on all residents of the building, particular focus on apartment above the girls' unit, discretion absolutely essential. The response came within seconds, confirmation that the task was understood and would be executed with speed, that Gray's reputation and compensation made standard. The walk to his own building took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that transformed with each block, prosperity giving way to maintenance deferred, security systems replaced by broken locks and hope. Gray noticed details he'd trained himself to observe: cameras that worked versus cameras that were theatrical props, graffiti that marked territory versus graffiti that was purely artistic expression, the way people moved on streets with relaxed confidence or hunched wariness that telegraphed everything about local power structures. Pike Street existed in transitional zone where gentrification pressed against entrenched poverty, conflict creating instability that could tip either direction. Tori's building was exactly what he'd expected: 5-story structure from the 1970s with exterior paint peeling in strips, and lobby door that didn't quite close properly despite multiple repair attempts. The security systems panel hung loose from the wall, wires exposed like open surgery, and the mailboxes bore dents, suggesting they'd been forced open repeatedly. Gray cataloged these vulnerabilities with automatic assessment, mind already planning improvements that would materially alter the safety profile of every resident, not just his specific concern. He didn't enter the building, not yet, but positioned himself across the street where angles allowed observation of multiple windows, including those he'd calculated must belong to Tori's apartment. Lights were off, confirming her mother's night shift schedule, and Gray felt renewed anger at circumstances that left child alone during hours when predators prowled. The apartment directly above showed dim illumination, flickering quality suggesting television left running, and as he watched, he heard it begin. The screaming started low, almost conversational in volume, then built with momentum that suggested inevitability, someone sliding down slope they couldn't arrest. Words were indistinct from this distance, but the anguish in them carried clearly, raw sound of someone reliving trauma that wouldn't release its grip. Gray understood immediately that this wasn't manufactured drama or substance-fueled rage, but genuine psychological crisis that required intervention beyond anything child should have to negotiate alone in darkness below. He timed the episode with his phone's stopwatch, clinical documentation of pattern that would inform his response strategy. 23 minutes of escalating intensity before it broke into sobbing, then another 10 minutes of gradually diminishing distress before silence reclaimed the night. Gray imagined Tori listening to this cycle, trying to sleep through sound that violated safety that homes were supposed to provide, and his hands clenched with rare display of emotion he usually controlled with better discipline. His phone vibrated with preliminary report from the investigator, information assembled from databases that theoretically required warrants, but which money and connections made accessible. The screamer's name was Marcus Webb, 34 years old, honorably discharged Marine who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan before medical retirement for psychological reasons. No criminal record, no history of violence toward others. Recipient of multiple service medals that testified to courage that hadn't protected him from what he'd witnessed and participated in overseas. The report included employment history showing spotty pattern of jobs started and abandoned, medical records indicating prescriptions for PTSD medications that had been filled irregularly, and financial information revealing disability payments that barely covered rent and basic expenses. Marcus Webb was drowning slowly in system that acknowledged his service with insufficient support, and his screaming was the sound of someone going under for what might be the final time. Gray recognized the profile of man who needed help, but lacked resources to access it, Another veteran failed by country that had used him and then abandoned him. Tori's mother's information came next. Courtney Hayes, 31 years old, emergency room nurse working double shifts to support daughter after divorce from husband, whose location was listed as unknown. Her financial situation was precarious, paycheck-to-paycheck existence, where single unexpected expense could trigger cascade of missed payments and escalating crisis. No criminal history, strong employment record, evidence of someone working desperately hard to provide stability in circumstances that made stability nearly impossible to achieve. The investigators' report included photographs from social media and public records, and Gray studied Courtney's face with attention that had nothing to do with the task at hand. She was beautiful in an exhausted way that showed someone burning themselves as fuel to keep others warm. Dark circles under eyes that smiled despite having reasons not to. Her hair in the photos was always pulled back practically, no time or energy for vanity, and her clothes suggested someone who bought functional rather than fashionable, because there was never budget for both. Gray forwarded the information on Marcus to his personal physician, doctor who'd treated various injuries over the years, without asking questions that would have complicated both their lives. The message included instruction to research best treatment facilities for severe PTSD, places where actual healing happened rather than storage locations that warehouse difficult cases. Money wasn't constraint. Results were only metric that mattered, and Gray knew that his resources could access level of care that Marcus's disability payments would never reach. The response came within the hour. List of 3 facilities that specialized in trauma treatment for veterans, places with success rates that justified their extraordinary costs. Gray selected the one in Oregon, far enough from Seattle to represent complete break from triggering environment, but close enough that family could visit if Marcus had anyone who cared. The facility's director would receive call in morning from benefactor offering to fund scholarship for veteran in need. Strings attached that required immediate admission and comprehensive treatment plan. But removing Marcus solved only half the equation, because Tori would still be alone in vulnerable building, with mother working impossible hours, still at risk from dangers that had nothing to do with screaming neighbor. Gray made additional notes about security improvements needed, about finding Courtney better paid position that didn't require night shifts, about creating circumstances where 6-year-old girl could sleep safely without needing to hire dangerous men to protect her. The scope of intervention expanded with each consideration. Simple favor transforming into comprehensive restructuring of multiple lives. His phone rang with number he recognized as his attorney, man who'd navigated countless complex situations and knew better than to call this late, without significant reason. The restaurant hostess called someone who called someone who called me, the lawyer reported with weary efficiency of professional accustomed to cleaning up his client's complications. There are questions about your dinner companion, and whether authorities need to be involved. Gray explained situation in economical sentences that conveyed essential facts without unnecessary detail, and heard the lawyer's sigh of relief that this wasn't scandal requiring aggressive damage control. So, you're playing guardian angel to a child you met an hour ago, the lawyer summarized with tone that suggested this wasn't even the strangest thing Gray had done this year. What do you need from me to make sure this doesn't blow back on you or complicate the girl's situation? Gray appreciated the practical approach, the immediate pivot from judgment to problem-solving that characterized their working relationship. He outlined requirements, documentation that would satisfy any inquiring authorities that Tori wasn't in danger, connections to child welfare system that could ensure no investigation traumatized her further, leverage to make this entire situation disappear from official notice. The screaming started again above, second episode of the night, and Gray checked his watch to note the timing pattern. If this happened twice nightly as Tori suggested, the woman was dealing with 4 to 5 hours of interrupted sleep attempts, impossible situation for child whose brain required rest for development. The sound cut through the rain-soaked night with quality that would penetrate any reasonable insulation, and Gray understood viscerally why Tori had reached point of desperate action. No child should have to endure this, and no adult should have to produce these sounds alone with no one helping. He crossed the street and entered the building through lobby door that yielded to gentle pressure, no functioning lock between vulnerable residents and whatever threats might arrive. The elevator showed out of service sign that looked permanent, so Gray took stairs that smelled of old cooking and mildew, walls marked with graffiti that ranged from artistic to threatening. Tori's apartment was on the 3rd floor, Marcus's directly above on the 4th, and Gray positioned himself on the landing between them, where he could observe both doors. The building's sounds surrounded him, television sets playing loudly in multiple languages, couple arguing about money somewhere above, infant crying with persistence that suggested hunger or pain, all of it layered together into symphony of poverty and struggle. Tori lived immersed in this daily, absorbing other people's stress through thin walls that provided privacy in theory, but not in acoustic reality. Gray thought of his own penthouse with its soundproofing and security, the insularity that wealth purchased from other people's problems, and felt something like shame at the contrast. Marcus's door showed fresh scratches around the lock, evidence that someone had attempted entry recently, and Gray wondered if that someone had been Tori trying to make the screaming stop through direct intervention. The courage that would require was staggering. Child confronting adult man in psychological crisis, without understanding what kind of danger that represented. That nothing bad had happened felt like luck rather than certainty, and Gray added immediate priority to getting Marcus into treatment before any violent episode endangered the building's residents. He descended the stairs and exited into rain that had finally lessened to drizzle, Seattle's perpetual moisture coating everything with layer of dampness that never quite dried. The night felt different now, weighted with responsibility he'd accepted without fully calculating its cost. Gray had built empire through careful risk assessment and strategic violence, through understanding exactly what each action would cost and what it would gain. But this situation defied such calculations because the stakes were measured in child's sleep and mother's exhaustion rather than territory or profit. His car waited where he'd left it, expensive vehicle that announced his presence to anyone who understood automotive hierarchies, and Gray slid into driver's seat without starting the engine immediately. He sat in darkness, reviewing everything he'd learned, constructing intervention strategy that would address root causes rather than just treating symptoms. Marcus needed treatment, Courtney needed better employment, Tori needed security and stability, and somehow Gray had appointed himself architect of solutions to problems that weren't his responsibility by any rational measure. The steering wheel was cold under his hands, and Gray noticed his own reflection in the rearview mirror, face that had forgotten how to show vulnerability years ago staring back at him with expression he didn't immediately recognize. It took several seconds to identify the emotion as hope, dangerous feeling that he'd trained himself to suppress, because hope led to expectations, and expectations led to devastation when they weren't met. But Tori's face when he'd promised help had triggered something dormant, possibility that his power and resources could serve purposes beyond accumulation and self-protection. Gray's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building designed to make proximity feel like distance, where neighbors never met in hallways because private elevators delivered residents directly to their domains. The space was decorated with art that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes, furniture selected by designer who understood that wealth should announce itself through understatement. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Seattle's glittering skyline, city lights reflecting off Puget Sound in patterns that suggested beauty, rather than the struggle happening in streets below. He poured whiskey from bottle older than Tori, liquid amber catching light as it filled crystal hand-blown by artisan in Venice. The ritual usually brought comfort, familiar sequence marking transition from business to personal time, but tonight the alcohol tasted like accusation. Gray set down the glass after single sip, unable to enjoy luxury while imagining child lying awake listening to screams. His phone displayed the investigator's complete report, hundreds of pages of data distilled from databases and surveillance and public records. Every detail of Marcus Webb's and Courtney Hayes' lives, laid bare with impressive and invasive efficiency. Gray read through medical records documenting Marcus's deterioration, treatment plans started and abandoned, medications that worked until they didn't. The trajectory was clear, man sliding toward complete breakdown without intervention that his circumstances couldn't provide. Courtney's employment records showed dedication bordering on self-destruction, double shifts accepted whenever offered, vacation days accumulated but never taken, performance reviews praising her competence while noting exhaustion that supervisors documented but didn't address. Her bank statements revealed mathematical tightrope walk, where single unexpected expense would trigger overdraft fees cascading into larger financial crisis. $300 in savings represented her entire safety net, amount Gray spent on single dinner without conscious thought. The divorce records told story of marriage ending not in dramatic betrayal, but grinding incompatibility. Husband who'd wanted different life than parenthood offered, and had simply left rather than continuing to pretend. No child support payments in 2 years, no contact information current enough to pursue legal remedies, just absence where partnership should have been. Courtney had absorbed the full weight of single parenthood without support system that made such circumstances survivable. Gray walked to the windows and looked down at city spreading beneath him, millions of individual stories playing out in lighted windows and darkened streets. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, Tori was alone in an apartment listening to Marcus's trauma, waiting for Mother to return from saving other people's lives. The distance between his position and hers could be measured in miles, but felt more accurately calculated in different currency entirely. His reflection in the glass showed man who'd spent 20 years building walls between himself and vulnerability, who'd learned that power came from emotional distance and strategic cruelty. The face staring back was handsome in a way that money and discipline maintained, no softness or doubt visible in features that had been trained to reveal nothing. But behind that carefully constructed mask, something was shifting, old foundations cracking under weight of 6-year-old's desperate courage. Gray's own childhood rose in his memory with clarity he usually suppressed, images he'd learned to lock away because remembering served no strategic purpose. His mother working 3 jobs to keep them an apartment not much better than Tori's, himself waiting alone through nights when neighborhood sounds carried threats that sometimes materialized. The loan shark he'd approached at 7 had taught him that asking for help from those with power was exercise in humiliation. That weakness invited exploitation rather than protection. That lesson had shaped everything that followed, the careful accumulation of resources and reputation that transformed him from vulnerable child into man others feared. Gray had built empire on principle that he would never again be powerless, never again be at mercy of others' whims or cruelty. Every decision had been calculated to increase his invulnerability, to ensure that he controlled outcomes rather than being controlled by them. But Tori's question had bypassed all those defenses with precision that felt almost surgical, reaching directly to the child he'd been, before learning that survival required becoming someone else entirely. "If I pay, can you stop the screaming?" Wasn't just request for help, but reminder that he'd once needed someone to stop his own screaming and no one had come. The recognition created obligation that transcended rational self-interest, connection to his former self that he couldn't dismiss or ignore. His phone buzzed with message from the Oregon Treatment Facility's director, confirmation that they could accept Marcus Webb immediately upon his consent to admission. The scholarship had been arranged through Foundation, Gray maintained for exactly such purposes, charitable vehicle that allowed intervention without direct attribution. Cost was substantial, but irrelevant. Number in account that would decrease without impacting his life in any measurable way, while potentially saving Marcus's life entirely. The logistics were straightforward. Convince Marcus that accepting treatment wasn't admission of failure, but exercise of courage. Transport him to facility with dignity rather than force. Ensure transition happened smoothly enough that Tori would wake to silence rather than absence. Gray had orchestrated far more complex operations, had moved pieces across boards where mistakes meant death rather than mere complications. This should have been simple application of resources to problem, but something about it felt more personal than any business he'd conducted in years. He opened laptop and began drafting email to hospital administrator where Courtney worked. Recommendation for nurse whose performance reviews suggested she was wasted in current position. The message came from anonymous donor who'd funded new wing and whose suggestions carried weight of continued financial support. It suggested Courtney Hayes be considered for day shift supervisor role that would increase her pay by 40%, while eliminating night work that was clearly burning her out. The email felt like playing God, rearranging lives through invisible influence that subjects would never know to question or resist. Gray paused before sending, aware that he was crossing lines that even his usual moral flexibility found questionable. But Tori's exhausted face haunted him, and Courtney's bank statements testified to desperation that made intervention feel like necessity rather than interference. He pressed send before doubt could transform into paralysis. His attorney called again, this time with better news. Child welfare inquiries had been redirected through channels that would ensure no investigation traumatized Tori unnecessarily. Documentation existed now that would satisfy any concerned parties that the girl was safe, that adult intervention was appropriate and protective rather than predatory. The legal machinery had been adjusted to produce outcomes Gray wanted, another demonstration of how power functioned when properly applied and adequately funded. Gray returned to the window and his reflection, studying the man who'd somehow become architect of strangers' lives based on single conversation with desperate child. His empire had been built through violence and intimidation, through understanding that fear was more reliable than love, and that loyalty purchased through self-interest lasted longer than loyalty earned through affection. These principles had served him well, had elevated him from poverty to penthouse, from powerless to powerful. But they offered no guidance for current situation, no framework for understanding why he cared whether Tori slept peacefully, or whether Courtney's exhaustion might finally ease. The emotions moving through him felt foreign and uncomfortable, vulnerability that threatened carefully maintained equilibrium. Gray had learned to eliminate weaknesses that others could exploit, and caring about people created vulnerabilities that were almost impossible to defend against. Yet he couldn't seem to stop himself from caring, couldn't dismiss Tori's courage as merely amusing anecdote, or Courtney's struggle as someone else's problem. The recognition that he'd once been them, once needed help that never came, had opened door he'd kept locked for decades. Behind that door waited all the feelings he'd suppressed to survive, all the needs he'd learned to deny because acknowledging them only created pain when they went unmet. Morning brought Seattle's typical gray sky, clouds pressing low over city like weighted blanket, and Gray found himself outside Marcus Webb's building before 8 a.m., with purpose he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. The exhaustion of sleepless nights sat heavy in his bones, unusual for someone who'd trained himself to function on minimal rest, but his mind had refused shutdown while planning interventions that grew more complex with each consideration. Marcus emerged from the building at 8:15, and Gray's first in-person sight of the man complicated his carefully constructed narrative. The veteran wasn't the monster Tori's description might have suggested, but rather painfully ordinary, medium height and build, moving with careful deliberation that suggested someone aware of his own fragility. His clothes were clean, but worn, jeans and jacket that had seen better years, and his eyes scanned the street with hypervigilance that never quite settled anywhere. Gray followed at distance that allowed observation without detection, watching Marcus navigate morning routine that revealed its own patterns of dysfunction. The veteran stopped at corner store for cigarettes, hands shaking slightly as he counted exact change, thanking the clerk with courtesy that seemed to cost him effort. He walked 3 blocks to VA clinic, where he apparently had regular appointment. Entering building that Gray's research had revealed was chronically understaffed and overwhelmed by patient load. The wait would be long, Gray knew from his investigator's report. Hours of sitting in crowded waiting room for 15-minute session with overworked therapist who couldn't possibly address depth of trauma Marcus carried. The system was designed to process veterans rather than heal them, to maintain them at functional baseline rather than restore them to anything resembling wellness. Marcus would emerge with prescription refills and appointment for next month, cycle perpetuating indefinitely without hope of actual resolution. Gray made phone call to the Oregon facility's director while sitting in his car outside the clinic, arranging details that would transform Marcus's trajectory if the man could be convinced to accept help. The director was former military herself, understood the specific combination of pride and shame that made veterans resist treatment, even as they drowned. She offered to make initial contact personally, to frame the opportunity in terms that might penetrate Marcus's resistance. 2 hours later, Marcus exited the clinic looking more exhausted than when he'd entered, clutching pharmacy bag that presumably contained medications that would dull symptoms without addressing causes. Gray watched him walk with head down against drizzle that had started, shoulders hunched in posture that spoke of defeat so complete it had become permanent condition. The urge to intervene immediately was strong, but Gray forced himself to patience that strategy required. Instead, he drove to the hospital where Courtney worked, parking in visitor lot and entering through main entrance with confidence that made him effectively invisible despite expensive suit. Hospitals were places where everyone was focused on their own emergencies, where well-dressed man moving with purpose attracted no attention or questions. He located the emergency room and positioned himself in waiting area, with clear view of nursing station where Courtney would presumably be finishing her shift. She appeared at 7:30, emerging from secured area with exhaustion written in every line of her body, scrubs wrinkled and hair escaping from ponytail that had probably been neat 12 hours earlier. Gray watched her sign out and exchange brief words with colleague, professional smile that didn't reach eyes that held the particular flatness of someone running on reserves that had been depleted long ago. She was beautiful despite the exhaustion, or perhaps because of it, vulnerability that wealth and ease could never quite replicate. Courtney gathered her belongings from locker and headed toward exit, moving with the automaticity of routine performed too many times to require conscious thought. Gray let her pass, not ready yet to make contact that would reveal his involvement in her life's upcoming changes. He needed to understand her completely, before initiating relationship that would alter everything, needed to ensure that his intervention would help, rather than harm, despite good intentions. He followed her at distance through parking lot to bus stop where she waited with other night shift workers, people whose jobs required them to labor while the city slept. The bus arrived, and she climbed aboard with others, finding seat by window where she immediately closed her eyes, stealing rest during 20-minute commute that would deliver her to building where her daughter waited. Gray watched the bus disappear into traffic, then returned to his car to continue surveillance that felt increasingly like obsession. The investigator's report had included Tori's school information, elementary school 3 blocks from their apartment, where she presumably walked alone each morning. Gray arrived at the building just before dismissal, parking where he could observe without being obvious, and watch stream of children emerge into afternoon accompanied by parents or older siblings, or in small groups that suggested neighborhood friendships. Tori appeared alone, yellow raincoat visible immediately among the crowd, walking with purpose toward home without pausing to socialize with classmates. Her isolation was evident even among chaos of dismissal, other children flowing around her without interaction, and Gray wondered whether her exhaustion showed in ways that made her unpopular, or whether poverty marked her as different in school where most families had resources hers lacked. She walked with head down, backpack too large for small frame, and disappeared around corner toward Pike Street, where screaming neighbor and sleeping mother waited. Gray's phone buzzed with notification that the email to hospital administrator had been read and forwarded to human resources with note indicating immediate action. Courtney would receive call tomorrow about interview for position she hadn't applied for, opportunity that would seem like incredible luck, rather than invisible hand rearranging her circumstances. The manipulation made him uncomfortable, even as he recognized it as necessary, intervention that she'd likely refuse if she knew its true source. He drove back to Pike Street and parked across from the building, watching windows that corresponded to Courtney's apartment until lights came on around 4 p.m. Tori was home from school, presumably doing homework or watching television while her mother slept in preparation for another night shift. The normalcy of it was heartbreaking, routine that should have been unremarkable, but was actually elaborate survival mechanism that would eventually fail under accumulated stress. Marcus's window remained dark until evening, and when lights finally appeared, Gray noted the time and settled in to observe the pattern that Tori had described. The screaming started at 9:45, right on schedule that suggested terrible consistency, and Gray heard it clearly even through closed car windows and across street. The sound carried visceral quality that made his own chest tighten, recognition of pain so profound it couldn't be contained by mere physical boundaries. He watched Courtney's window throughout the episode, saw lights remain off in what was presumably Tori's bedroom, imagined the child lying awake listening to sounds that probably invaded her dreams, even when they finally stopped. The screaming lasted 31 minutes tonight, longer than previous evening, and when it ended the silence felt heavy with all the words that suffering couldn't quite articulate. Gray sat in the darkness and understood that he'd been right to intervene, that some situations required exactly the kind of power he'd spent his life accumulating. His phone displayed message from the treatment facility director. She'd made initial contact with Marcus through VA coordinator, who'd positioned the opportunity as earned benefit rather than charity. Marcus had responded with cautious interest, agreeing to phone conversation tomorrow to discuss details. The foundation was being laid for transformation that Marcus couldn't yet imagine, rescue from drowning that he'd stopped believing possible. Gray started his car as lights in Courtney's apartment finally went off around 10:30, mother presumably leaving for night shift, while daughter remained alone with Marcus's potential for another episode. The pattern would continue until he disrupted it, cycle perpetuating until external force altered the variables that sustained it. Tomorrow, he would begin that disruption in earnest, would set in motion changes that would ripple through 3 interconnected lives in ways they'd spend years trying to understand. The treatment facility director called Gray at 6 a.m. with news that Marcus had agreed to admission after phone conversation that had apparently broken through his resistance. She'd framed the opportunity as honor bestowed on veteran whose service deserved comprehensive care, not charity for broken person who'd failed to maintain himself. The psychological reframing had worked where direct appeals to self-interest might have failed, allowing Marcus to accept help without acknowledging desperation that had made help necessary. Transport would happen today, private car that would arrive at noon to take Marcus directly to Oregon facility where intake process had been streamlined to minimize institutional intimidation. His apartment lease would be maintained for 6 months, belongings secured, utilities kept current, so he'd have home to return to if treatment succeeded in restoring function. Gray had insisted on these details against director's suggestion that clean break might serve Marcus better, but something in him refused to burn bridges that veteran might need for psychological safety. He called his attorney and outlined requirements for managing Marcus's absence, ensuring disability payments continued uninterrupted, that mail was collected and important documents handled, that nothing in the veteran's life would collapse during treatment. The attorney worked with usual efficiency, arranging power of attorney through emergency procedure that would activate immediately upon Marcus's signature. Legal mechanisms clicked into place with speed that money and connections made possible. Infrastructure of support, appearing as if it had always existed. Gray reviewed the hospital administrator's response regarding Courtney, satisfaction in knowing that interview was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon on her day off. The position would be presented as internal promotion that her performance reviews had flagged her for, recognition of dedication that made her ideal candidate for supervisory role. She'd have no reason to suspect manipulation, would experience it as validation of hard work, finally paying dividends that her circumstances desperately needed. By 10 a.m., Gray was positioned near Marcus's building again, unable to stay away despite having orchestrated events that should have allowed him distance from direct involvement. His usual practice was to delegate execution while maintaining strategic oversight, but something about this situation demanded his presence in ways he didn't fully understand. Perhaps he needed to witness Marcus's departure to believe that intervention was actually happening, that the screaming that had driven child to desperate action would finally stop. The private car arrived precisely at noon, luxury sedan that announced importance of its passenger without ostentatious display. The driver entered the building with folder containing all necessary paperwork, instructions to present opportunity with dignity that Marcus's service had earned. Gray watched from his usual position across the street, phone ready in case complications required immediate attention, but the operation proceeded with smoothness that preparation had made inevitable. Marcus emerged 20 minutes later carrying single duffel bag, moving with the hesitation of someone still not quite believing in escape from circumstances that had become prison. The facility director had coached him through phone call that apparently lasted hours, building trust that allowed him to risk hope, despite all the times hope had been disappointed. He paused before entering the car, looking up at the building that had contained his suffering, and Gray saw something like relief cross his features before he climbed inside. The car pulled away smoothly, beginning journey that would take Marcus to coast where ocean sounds would replace urban noise, and professional care would replace isolated struggle. Gray felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat, recognition that he'd just altered trajectory of life that had been spiraling toward tragedy. The power to change circumstances through pure application of resources and will was intoxicating, reminder of why he'd fought so hard to escape powerlessness that characterized his early years. He called the investigator with instructions to monitor Marcus's apartment, ensure no one attempted break-in during vacancy that might become permanent if treatment succeeded in relocating veteran to better circumstances. Security company would install discrete system today, cameras and sensors that would alert monitoring service to any unauthorized entry. The building's other residents would benefit from spillover security, though they'd never know that one tenant's departure had triggered protection they hadn't requested. Gray remained parked outside the building until evening, observing the space where Marcus's window stayed dark for first time in months. Tori would notice the silence tonight, would probably wait with anxiety for screaming that wouldn't come, uncertain whether absence represented solution or merely prelude to something worse. He wished he could explain to her that her $73 had purchased exactly what she'd requested. That dangerous man she'd hired had actually made the screaming stop. Courtney's window showed life proceeding as usual. Mother presumably resting before another night shift that would be her last on such schedule if tomorrow's interview proceeded as Gray had arranged. His intervention was comprehensive, but invisible. Changes that would feel like luck rather than manipulation. And he wondered if that deception was kindness or cowardice. Perhaps they deserved to know that someone had cared enough to rearrange reality on their behalf, but perhaps that knowledge would create debt where he wanted only to balance ancient accounts. His phone displayed message from the facility confirming Marcus's safe arrival and successful intake, initial assessment indicating he was excellent candidate for intensive treatment program. The veteran had cried during check-in process, director reported, relief so profound it had overwhelmed defenses he'd maintained for years. Gray read the message twice, arrested by image of grown man weeping with gratitude for help that should have been available through systems designed exactly for such support. The sky darkened into evening, and lights appeared in windows throughout the building, lives proceeding in their individual patterns of routine and struggle. Tori's bedroom light came on at her usual bedtime, and Gray imagined her lying in bed waiting for screaming that wouldn't interrupt her rest. Tomorrow she'd wake more refreshed than she'd been in months, confusion about the silence gradually giving way to cautious hope that perhaps the nightmare had finally ended. Courtney left for her shift at 10:15, walking to bus stop with exhaustion that tomorrow's interview might begin to address. Gray watched her disappear into night, then finally started his car and drove back to Penthouse that felt emptier than usual despite its careful decoration and expensive contents. The distance between his world and theirs seemed more pronounced after a day spent observing their lives, contrast that made his luxury feel less like achievement and more like indictment. He poured whiskey, and this time actually drank it, standing at windows that displayed city he'd conquered through careful application of violence and strategy. The lights below represented millions of stories, countless struggles he'd never know about or have power to affect. But 3 lives on Pike Street were different now because he'd chosen intervention over indifference, because 6-year-old girl's courage had triggered something in him that wealth and power hadn't completely destroyed. The question that had haunted him since Tori's appearance kept returning with new intensity. What happened to the boy who'd needed someone to stop his own screaming and received only lesson that asking for help was exercise in humiliation? Gray studied his reflection in dark glass, seeing both the man he'd become and the child he'd been, wondering if perhaps the distance between those two versions wasn't as absolute as he'd believed. His phone showed photo the investigator had captured earlier. Tori walking home from school alone, yellow raincoat bright against gray afternoon, backpack weighing down small shoulders that had already learned to carry more than childhood should require. Gray saved the image despite no strategic reason to keep it, evidence of something he couldn't name but recognized as important. Tomorrow would bring new developments, Courtney's interview, and Tori's first full night of peaceful sleep, and he'd be watching from his usual distance to ensure his invisible intervention continued producing intended outcomes. The whiskey finished, glass empty in his hand, and Gray remained at the window until dawn began lightening the eastern sky. Sleep hadn't come despite exhaustion, mind too active with planning and second-guessing and unfamiliar emotions that felt dangerously close to something that might be called caring. He'd intervened in Marcus's life, rearranged Courtney's circumstances, and now he was invested in ways that created vulnerability he'd spent decades learning to avoid. The first night without screaming passed in silence so complete that Tori woke repeatedly, checking her small alarm clock to confirm she hadn't somehow slept through the usual disturbance. Gray knew this because he'd positioned himself across from the building again, unable to stay away despite exhaustion pulling at him like physical weight. He watched her bedroom light flick on at 11 p.m., then again at 1:30, then once more at 3, each time staying illuminated for several minutes before darkness returned. Morning brought transformation subtle but unmistakable in the way Tori emerged from the building for school. Her steps carried lightness that yesterday's trudge had lacked, yellow raincoat seeming brighter somehow, though weather remained its typical gray. She paused on the sidewalk and looked up at Marcus's window with expression Gray couldn't quite read from his distance, something between confusion and cautious hope that perhaps the nightmare had actually ended. Gray followed her route to school at distance that had become familiar, watching her navigate sidewalks with energy that proper sleep restored. At the crosswalk near her school, she helped smaller child retrieve dropped backpack, interaction he hadn't observed in previous days when exhaustion had narrowed her focus to mere survival. The simple kindness suggested that she had capacity to spare now, resources no longer completely consumed by managing her own distress. Courtney's interview was scheduled for 2 p.m., and Gray positioned himself in hospital cafeteria, with newspaper and coffee that gave him excuse to occupy corner table with clear view of administrative offices. She arrived 15 minutes early, wearing dress that was clearly her best, but showed age in way that suggested limited wardrobe options. Her hair had been styled with care that morning routine usually didn't allow, and she carried folder containing copies of certifications and performance reviews that no one had actually requested. The interview lasted 45 minutes, longer than standard screening would require, and when Courtney emerged, her expression showed cautious disbelief that made Gray's chest constrict with unexpected emotion. She'd been offered the position on spot, HR director later confirmed through channels Gray maintained, impressed by credentials that indeed warranted promotion, but had been overlooked in chaos of understaffed department. Courtney would start new role in 2 weeks. Day shift with 40% raise and benefits that included childcare assistance she hadn't known to ask for. Gray watched her exit the building and pause on the steps, pulling out phone to call someone with news that clearly demanded immediate sharing. Her face transformed during the conversation, exhaustion giving way to something that might have been joy if she'd had enough energy left to fully express it. She laughed at something the person said, sound carrying across the distance, and Gray realized he'd never heard her laugh before, hadn't known that sound existed in repertoire of someone he'd been observing so carefully. 3 days passed in pattern that established new normal. Marcus's window stayed dark. Tori walked to school with increasing energy. Courtney worked her final night shifts with countdown mentality of someone seeing finish line after marathon. Gray maintained surveillance with dedication that would have alarmed him if he'd stopped to examine his own behavior, unable to disengage from situation he'd set in motion despite having achieved stated objectives. The investigators' reports documented Marcus's progress in treatment, early stages showing typical resistance giving way to engagement as he began processing trauma with therapists who had time and training to actually help. Group sessions with other veterans created community he'd been lacking, men who understood his experiences without needing explanation or justification. The facility's director reported cautious optimism about long-term prognosis, suggesting that Marcus might emerge from treatment genuinely healed, rather than merely stabilized. Tori's teacher sent note home praising improved attention and participation. Document Gray intercepted through channels he'd established in school's administrative system. The teacher attributed changes to some positive development at home, unaware that the positive development was simply absence of nightly trauma that had been eroding the child's capacity to function. Gray added the note to file he was compiling, evidence of intervention's success that he reviewed with satisfaction that felt dangerously close to pride. Courtney's first day on new shift coincided with Tori's discovery that afternoons could include more than just waiting for Mother to wake. Gray observed their reunion after school with something uncomfortably close to voyeurism, watching through carefully positioned cameras as mother and daughter walked to park together for first time in recent memory. They sat on swings talking with animation that suggested conversation about something other than logistics and survival, relationship beginning to expand beyond crisis management. The building itself seemed different in Marcus's absence, other residents commenting to each other about the unusual quiet in ways Gray's audio surveillance captured and transcribed. No one knew where the veteran had gone, speculation ranging from family emergency to hospitalization to arrest, but universal response was relief rather than concern. His suffering had been disturbing their lives more than any of them had acknowledged while it was happening, burden lifted, revealing how heavy it had actually been. Gray's attorney called with update on Marcus's legal affairs, everything proceeding smoothly with disability payments secured and apartment maintained exactly as promised. The foundation scholarship required quarterly reports on recipients' progress, documentation that would allow Gray to track Marcus's trajectory even after direct surveillance ended. Control was being maintained through institutional structures rather than personal involvement, transition that should have felt like appropriate distance, but instead registered as abandonment of responsibility. His own sleep had improved marginally, with knowledge that Tori was sleeping peacefully, correlation he noticed, but refused to analyze too deeply. The penthouse felt less like sanctuary, and more like expensive cage, isolation that he'd once treasured now seeming like poverty of different kind. Wealth had bought him privacy and security, but also separation from the kind of connection he was observing between Courtney and Tori, relationship sustained through shared struggle rather than comfortable independence. 2 weeks after Marcus's departure, Tori returned to the restaurant where she'd first approached Gray, appearing at dinner service with same determination, but different energy entirely. The hostess recognized her immediately and moved to intercept, but Gray caught her eye with slight headshake that communicated permission for the child's approach. Tori navigated between tables with confidence that proper sleep had restored, yellow raincoat replaced by purple jacket that looked new, suggesting Courtney's improved finances were already manifesting in material ways. She stopped at Gray's table and carefully placed $73 on the white linen, bills no longer crumpled, but neatly arranged. Same money he'd refused to accept weeks earlier. The screaming stopped, she said simply, voice carrying gratitude and confusion in equal measure. And my mom got a better job, and I wanted to say thank you even though I don't understand how you did it. Her eyes searched his face for explanation he couldn't provide without revealing extent of his intervention. Gray looked at the money between them, currency that represented everything to child who'd saved it, and nothing to man who'd spent thousands making her request reality. I didn't do anything that required payment, he said carefully, maintaining fiction that her $73 had somehow purchased the comprehensive restructuring of 3 lives. Sometimes problems solve themselves when the right people pay attention. The lie was gentle but complete, protecting her from knowledge that might create debt where he wanted only to settle ancient accounts. Tori studied him with those two old eyes that seemed to see through carefully constructed deception, child's intuition recognizing that his explanation didn't match the scope of changes she'd experienced. "My mom says we've been really lucky lately," she ventured, "but it's weird that our luck started the same night I talked to you." Gray felt exposed under her scrutiny, found himself unable to maintain eye contact with 6-year-old, who'd somehow become his conscience and his mirror simultaneously. "Maybe your luck was always there," he offered, "just waiting for someone to notice you deserved it." The deflection felt weak even as he spoke it, but Tori seemed to accept the explanation, or at least recognize that pushing further would violate some unspoken agreement between them. She left the money on the table and departed with small wave, purple, jacket, disappearing into evening that no longer held the same terrors it had contained weeks earlier. Gray collected the $73 after Tori left and sat staring at the crumpled bills that represented her entire emergency fund, wealth she'd been willing to spend on solving problem that adults should have addressed. He folded the money carefully and placed it in his wallet, intending to return it through some indirect method that wouldn't insult her pride. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its value, physical reminder of the trust she'd placed in dangerous stranger because circumstances had left her no safer options. The investigators' latest report included detail that changed everything. Courtney had been asking neighbors about Marcus's disappearance, concern for the troubled veteran apparently overriding her relief at the silence his absence created. She'd contacted VA trying to locate him, worried that he might have harmed himself or been hospitalized without support system to advocate for his care. Her compassion for someone whose suffering had been disrupting her daughter's life suggested character that money couldn't purchase and circumstances hadn't destroyed. Gray made decision that strategy would have counseled against, instructing his attorney to arrange accidental encounter at coffee shop Courtney frequented on her new schedule. The meeting needed to appear organic, chance intersection of two people whose lives had no obvious connection, but orchestrating such accidents was exactly the kind of manipulation Gray had perfected over decades of engineering desired outcomes. He arrived 30 minutes before Courtney's usual time, positioning himself at table with clear sightlines and newspaper that provided cover for waiting. She entered at 4:15, exactly when surveillance had predicted, moving with energy that 2 weeks of day shifts had partially restored. The exhaustion hadn't completely lifted from her features. Years of sleep debt couldn't be erased in mere days. But something fundamental had shifted in the way she carried herself. Gray watched her order coffee with pleasant exchange with barista, normalcy of the interaction suggesting she had capacity for social connection when survival wasn't consuming all available resources. The accidental meeting happened when she turned from counter and nearly collided with him, coffee threatening to spill, before his hand steadied her cup with reflex that was genuine despite staged nature of encounter. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately. Automatic apology of someone accustomed to assuming fault, and her eyes lifted to his with startled recognition that he hadn't anticipated. "You're the man from the restaurant," she continued. "The one Tori talked to about the screaming." Gray's careful planning evaporated in face of her direct acknowledgement. Script he'd prepared becoming useless when she'd already identified their connection. "She told you about that?" he asked, buying time to recalibrate while his mind raced through implications of her knowing about their interaction. Courtney's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to catalog, settling finally on something between gratitude and suspicion that suggested intelligence he'd underestimated despite having read her entire life history. She said a man in expensive restaurant promised to help, and then the screaming stopped, and I got promoted, and Marcus disappeared, and I don't believe in coincidences that comprehensive. Her voice carried accusation wrapped in curiosity, demand for truth that he couldn't deflect with usual evasions. Gray gestured to empty chair at his table, invitation that she accepted after brief hesitation, sitting with posture that suggested readiness to flee if his explanation proved threatening rather than reassuring. He explained in carefully edited version that omitted surveillance and manipulation, while acknowledging intervention on Marcus's behalf, framing it as connecting troubled veteran with treatment resources that foundation he supported had available. Courtney listened with focus that suggested she was hearing both what he said and what he didn't say, parsing truth from performance with skill developed through years of reading patients in emergency room. "And my promotion?" she asked when he finished. "Was that also your foundation's work?" Gray met her eyes and made choice that felt like jumping without knowing depth of water below. Yes. The admission hung between them with weight of confession, and he watched her process information that confirmed her suspicions about extent of his involvement in her life. Her expression cycled through anger at manipulation, gratitude for results, confusion about motivation, finally settling into something that might have been understanding. Why? She asked simply, question containing multitudes about his reasons and methods and what he expected in return. Because your daughter asked me to stop the screaming with courage that most adults don't possess, and I remembered being her age and needing help that never came. The truth emerged more complete than he'd intended. Vulnerability he rarely displayed cracking through carefully maintained facade. Courtney's face softened at his explanation, recognition of shared damage that created connection despite the gulf between their circumstances. So you're playing guardian angel to strangers because someone failed to protect you? The assessment was accurate enough to sting, but Gray didn't flinch from it, discovering that he was tired of maintaining walls that separated him from authentic interaction. Something like that, he acknowledged, though guardian angels probably don't use quite as much surveillance and manipulation to achieve their objectives. His admission of methodology that crossed ethical lines should have alarmed her, but instead she laughed, sound he'd heard from distance but never directed at him, warmth that transformed her exhausted features into something approaching beauty. I should be furious with you for interfering in my life without permission, Courtney said, but her tone suggested she wasn't quite managing the fury she claimed she should feel. But Tori is sleeping through nights for first time in months, and I'm working hours that let me actually be her mother instead of just her absent provider, and Marcus is getting help he desperately needed, so it's hard to maintain appropriate outrage. Her pragmatism appealed to Gray, recognition that results sometimes justified questionable methods. They talked for 2 hours, conversation flowing with ease that Gray hadn't experienced in years of carefully curated social interactions designed to maintain image, rather than build connection. Courtney was sharply intelligent and darkly funny, capable of laughing at circumstances that had nearly destroyed her while maintaining compassion for others struggling through similar situations. She asked about his work with careful avoidance of specifics that suggested she'd intuited he operated in gray areas law didn't quite reach, and he appreciated her not demanding confessions that would complicate developing rapport. He walked her to bus stop when coffee shop began closing, Seattle evening cooling into night that no longer held quite the same edge of threat it had carried weeks earlier. Can I see you again? Gray asked at the stop, question feeling both absurd given his resources and genuine given his uncertainty about her response. Courtney studied him with assessment that took in expensive suit and careful grooming and underlying loneliness that money couldn't quite disguise. On one condition, she said finally, no more secret interventions in my life without asking first. Gray wanted to promise complete transparency, but couldn't quite force the lie past lips that had learned to value honesty in limited contexts where he could afford truth. I'll try, he offered instead. But I've spent 20 years solving problems through careful manipulation, and changing fundamental approach patterns might take time. His candor seemed to satisfy her more than false promises would have. Acknowledgement of limitations creating foundation for trust, more solid than pretended perfection. She gave him her number before boarding the bus that would take her back to Pike Street, and Gray watched vehicle disappear into traffic with feeling he couldn't quite name but recognized as hope. The emotion was dangerous and destabilizing. Vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies who'd learned his patterns over years of conflict and competition. But standing alone at the bus stop with Courtney's number in his phone, Gray found he didn't care about strategic implications, too focused on possibility of connection to worry about costs that connection might eventually demand. He returned to Penthouse and poured whiskey that tasted different tonight, celebration rather than anesthetic, and stood at windows looking down at city that seemed less alien than it had weeks earlier. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights, Tori was sleeping peacefully, and Courtney was probably already planning questions she'd ask on their next meeting, and Marcus was working through trauma with professionals who might actually help him heal. Gray had disrupted 3 lives through application of power and resources, and for first time in years, the disruption felt like creation rather than destruction. His reflection in the glass showed man who'd somehow become entangled in human connection, despite carefully constructed isolation. Criminal who'd been recruited by 6-year-old to use his danger for protection, rather than predation. The transformation wasn't complete, and might not be permanent, but standing there with Courtney's number saved in his phone and Tori's $73 in his wallet, Gray allowed himself to believe that perhaps the screaming he'd been hired to stop included echoes of his own that had been reverberating through decades of calculated cruelty and strategic violence. 3 months transformed relationships that initial interventions had made possible, time allowing connections to deepen beyond crisis that had sparked them. Gray and Courtney met twice weekly at coffee shop that had hosted their first deliberate encounter, conversations expanding from careful revelation to comfortable familiarity. She'd learned selective details about his business operations without demanding specifics that would force him to choose between honesty and safety. Pragmatic acceptance that some knowledge was better left unacknowledged. Tori had noticed her mother's improved mood and drawn accurate conclusions about its source, observing Gray at distance during several of their public meetings with assessment that made him simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. She'd approached him once outside coffee shop to inform him that her mother deserved someone nice, and that if he hurt her, she knew people who might hurt him back, threat delivered with 6-year-old seriousness that made it somehow more potent than adult intimidation would have managed. Marcus had completed initial treatment phase and transitioned to outpatient program that allowed him to maintain apartment while attending daily therapy sessions at local facility Gray's Foundation had connected him with. The veteran's progress was documented in quarterly reports that showed gradual healing occurring in increments too small to notice daily, but transformative when viewed across months. He'd started volunteering at VA, helping other veterans navigate treatment resources he'd learned existed, turning his own suffering into expertise that served others still drowning in similar darkness. The building on Pike Street had undergone subtle improvements that residents attributed to new management company rather than individual intervention. Security system that actually functioned, repairs to lobby door and elevator, fresh paint that covered years of accumulated grime. Gray's investment in the property had been anonymous and comprehensive, ensuring that Tori's safety and Marcus's eventual return would happen in circumstances materially better than those that had created crisis requiring intervention in first place. Gray had reduced his involvement in day-to-day criminal operations, delegating responsibilities to trusted lieutenants while he focused on foundation work that had expanded beyond single veterans treatment to comprehensive support system for multiple cases. The shift wasn't retirement, but recalibration, discovering that power could serve purposes beyond accumulation and self-protection. His reputation remained intact, fear he'd cultivated over decades still functioning to maintain his position, but the internal experience of that power had transformed from satisfaction to something more complex. Courtney's apartment showed evidence of improved circumstances in ways both material and atmospheric. New furniture that replaced items held together through determination and prayer, groceries that included fresh produce rather than just shelf-stable necessities, Tori's clothes that fit properly and matched and showed no signs of being handed down through multiple previous owners. But more significant than possessions was the quality of interaction Gray observed when invited for dinner, ease between mother and daughter that came from having energy to spare for connection rather than just survival. Tonight marked 4 months since Tori's desperate visit to expensive restaurant, and Gray was returning to that same establishment for dinner he'd arranged with careful consideration of symbolism. He'd invited both Courtney and Tori to join him at his regular table, formal acknowledgement of the relationship that had developed from crisis into something resembling family configuration he'd never expected to participate in. The restaurant staff had prepared for the unusual guests with discretion that Gray's patronage commanded, high chair replaced with booster seat and children's menu created specially for the occasion. They arrived together, Courtney in dress that was new and actually fit properly, Tori in outfit that matched her mother's formal presentation with purple jacket that had become her signature, replacing the yellow raincoat that had marked her poverty. Gray stood when he saw them enter, gesture of respect that turned heads throughout the restaurant accustomed to his solitary dining. The hostess who'd witnessed Tori's first desperate visit smiled with genuine warmth at seeing the child return under such different circumstances, redemption arc visible even to casual observers. Tori climbed into her seat with confidence that proper nutrition and consistent sleep had restored. No longer small and frightened, but still appropriately sized for her age, childhood reclaimed through removal of burdens that had forced premature maturity. She looked around the restaurant with interest rather than desperation, taking in details she'd been too focused to notice during her first visit. "It's prettier than I remembered," she said to Gray. "Or maybe I just couldn't see it before because I was so scared." Gray felt something shift in his chest at her observation, recognition that fear and desperation had colored her initial perception, just as they'd colored his entire adult life, preventing him from seeing possibilities beyond survival and domination. Fear makes everything look different, he agreed quietly, like looking through dirty window that blocks the light. Courtney reached across table and squeezed his hand briefly, acknowledgement of vulnerability he was displaying that didn't come naturally to man who'd built empire on appearing invulnerable. The meal proceeded with easy conversation that touched on Tori's improved grades and Courtney's increasing competence in supervisory role, and Marcus's latest letter from Oregon describing breakthrough he'd experienced in trauma therapy. Gray contributed updates about Foundation's expansion into housing support for homeless veterans, project inspired by Marcus's case that would provide comprehensive services rather than just temporary shelter. The scope of his intervention had grown from single crisis to systematic approach that addressed root causes of veteran homelessness and untreated trauma. Dessert arrived with presentation that made Tori's eyes widen, chocolate construction that looked more like architecture than food, and Gray watched her careful navigation of whether to preserve it or consume it. Courtney whispered something that made her daughter laugh and dig in with enthusiasm that proper childhood should include, joy in simple pleasures that deprivation had previously denied. The sound of that laughter did something to Gray that he couldn't quite name, warmth spreading through chest that usually remained defended against such feelings. "I need to tell you both something," Gray said when dessert was finished, and coffee had been poured for adults, moment he'd been building toward all evening finally arriving. "I've spent most of my adult life accumulating power and using it to protect myself and expand my control, but Tori's visit 4 months ago changed something fundamental about why I do what I do." He looked at the child who'd had courage to approach dangerous stranger with impossible request, seeing in her face the boy he'd been before, learning that asking for help was admission of weakness. "You reminded me that power without purpose beyond self-protection is just elaborate hiding, and that the screaming I heard wasn't just your neighbors, but echoes of my own that I'd been ignoring for 20 years. Tori listened with seriousness that suggested she understood he was offering truth that cost something to reveal. Courtney's hand found his again under table, support that allowed him to continue excavating feelings he'd buried under calculated cruelty and strategic violence. "So I want to thank you for being brave enough to ask dangerous person for help, because you saved more than just yourself from the screaming." Gray's voice carried emotion he usually controlled with better discipline, cracks in facade revealing the damage underneath that Tori's courage had forced him to finally address. The restaurant continued its oblivious consumption around them, but at their table something fundamental was being acknowledged, connection between 3 damaged people who'd somehow found healing through each other's courage to be vulnerable. Tori reached across table and patted his hand with gesture that was simultaneously childish and impossibly wise, comfort offered from someone who understood suffering despite her age. "You're welcome," she said simply, "and thank you for stopping the screaming even though I couldn't really pay you what it was worth." Gray smiled at her assessment, recognition that she'd understood from beginning that $73 wasn't adequate payment for what she was requesting, but had offered it anyway, because asking was more important than having sufficient resources. "You paid me exactly what it was worth," he corrected gently, pulling the crumpled bills from his wallet where he'd kept them for 4 months, "because your courage was the currency I needed, not your money." He handed the $73 back to her, watching her face cycle through confusion to understanding to something that might have been wisdom beyond her years. "But I want you to keep this safe," he continued, "because someday you might meet someone who needs help and has courage to ask for it, and then you can be the dangerous person they hire." The concept clearly appealed to her, possibility of becoming helper rather than just recipient of help, transformation from victim to protector that Gray recognized from his own trajectory. She carefully folded the bills and put them in her pocket, treating them as sacred trust, rather than merely returned money, understanding that he was giving her more than currency. Courtney watched this exchange with expression that suggested she was revising her assessment of man who'd intervened in their lives through manipulation and surveillance, but had somehow become essential part of their transformation. They left restaurant together into Seattle night that smelled of rain and possibility, 3 people whose connection defied conventional categories, but felt more like family than many legal relationships managed. Gray walked them to bus stop where he'd first asked Courtney for second meeting, 4 months creating routine that transformed strangeness into comfort. "Next time we're doing this at my place," Courtney said firmly, "because you've paid for enough expensive dinners and I want you to eat my cooking and tell me honestly whether it's terrible." Gray accepted the invitation with smile that felt unpracticed but genuine, expression his face had forgotten how to form during years of maintaining image rather than experiencing emotion. The bus arrived and Tori waved from window as it pulled away, yellow, No, purple, jacket visible, until vehicle disappeared around corner into night that no longer held the terrors that had driven desperate child to seek help from dangerous stranger. Gray stood alone at bus stop and realized he wasn't actually alone anymore, that somewhere in process of stopping screaming, he'd been recruited into connection that had transformed isolation into belonging. He walked back toward his building through neighborhoods that felt different now that he understood them as containing stories, rather than just resources or threats. Millions of individual struggles that his power could occasionally address, if applied with Tori's courage and Courtney's compassion. The penthouse waited above with its expensive art and careful decoration, but Gray found himself hesitating before entering, aware that returning to isolation after experiencing connection would feel more like imprisonment than sanctuary. His phone buzzed with message from Marcus, first direct contact between them since the veteran had departed for treatment. Simple thank you and update that he was coming home next month, ready to rebuild life with tools he'd learned through comprehensive care that Gray's intervention had provided. Gray saved the message with satisfaction that felt entirely different from pleasure he'd derived from successful business operations, recognition that this success was measured in healing rather than conquest, in connection rather than control. The screaming that had brought them all together had stopped, but something new had emerged in the silence. Possibility that power could serve purposes beyond self-protection, that danger could be recruited for protection rather than predation, that asking for help was sometimes the bravest action available rather than admission of weakness. Gray carried these revelations up to Penthouse that felt less empty than it had 4 months ago, understanding that Tori's $73 had purchased transformation none of them had expected, but all of them desperately needed. Thank you all for following this story. If you've connected with Gray, Tori, and Courtney's journey, please write in the comments from where you're watching this story unfold. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to you. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is offer it.